Hello, and welcome to the podcast that today tries to answer one simplish question. What is this thing called Christmas noir? I'm your host, Sergio Angelini, and today I'm joined by two of my bestest friends, Simon Brown and Stacey Abbott, who love Christmas movies, and today we're going to talk about those crossover films, those film noir movies that have a Christmas setting. Does that make them Christmas noir or just film noir set at Christmas? We've picked 6 of our favourite films and we'll be looking at them in chronological order, except for the very last one. We've saved the best till last and really hope you'll enjoy it. We had a little bit of trouble with the audio. This was recorded not in the studio, but out on location, or rather at Simon and Stacey's home, and there was a little bit of reverb and a few other technical problems, and I'm extremely grateful to my friend Fraser Ash for helping me sort that out, but it does mean that it doesn't sound quite like perhaps some of the normal podcasts do here at Tipping My Fedora, but I really hope you enjoy it. Welcome to the first ever Tipping My Fedora Christmas Noir episode. I am joined on my left by
Stacey Abbott.
And further on her right,
Simon Rail.
And in fact, Stacey, you're on my right, not my left, but never mind. Anyway, welcome to your own home where we're recording this episode in the presence of your lovely Lily.
Yeah, she's the silent contributor.
That's right, but she's watched a lot of Christmas movies in this place. Christmas noir obviously seems like a deliberately unorthodox or contradictory idea, but I don't think so. I think there's rather too many films that fit the bill, and it seems an interesting notion to explore. Does it de-noir it? Does it stop it from being really effective, or actually does it just work as counterpoint? So we're here with our cups of tea, our various mugs, so there will be clunking and clanking during our recording session. We decided to give ourselves a soft launch, so we included what I would refer to as a pre-noir. It's one of our favorite Christmas movies ever, which also happens to have murder and mayhem in it. The Thin Man, starring William Powell and Myrna Loy. What is it about The Thin Man that you guys love so much, and why does it say noir to you?
For me, what I love is the relationship between the central characters of Nick and Nora, a married couple, appropriate for Simon and I, a married couple who end up investigating murder, or what starts off as a missing person and then actually is revealed to be murder. So I think what I love is the repartee between them, which even though it is, as you say, a proto-noir, it has that kind of sharp, often edgy dialogue that I think leans. Obviously, it does lean more into comedy, but it has that edgy dialogue we associate with noir.
Yeah.
And a really kind of great relationship between a married couple, which I think is really what makes it so much fun.
I mean, I think that's what I always remember the most about it, is just how great their relationship is. I mean, I'm sure you two go out and have multiple cocktails when you go out on the town and take Lily with you.
Who do you think we are?
Well, I mean, I'm just saying, it's my fantasy idea of when you two go out solving crimes in high society. But we should say, obviously, first of all, The Thin Man, it's a great movie, originally released in 1934, based on a great novel by Dashiell Hammett. And he was a writer associated with the kind of hard-boiled fiction that we think of as being central to noir. So it's got bona fides, and yet the book itself was a bit of a departure because it feels a little bit soft-boiled. Although, at the time the book came out, it had a massive buzz about it because it was controversial, which has nothing to do with the film version. Do you know what that was? It was sold on the back of a scandalous single word that was used in a sentence in the book. There's a scene where Nick has a tussle with one of the suspects, who's a blonde, and Nora sort of says, "How was that for you?" And he makes a throwaway remark. In the advertising, Alfred Knopf, who was running the company then, had issues, but ultimately let it through with the use of one word, which is that Nora says to him, "Did you have an erection when you had a tussle?" And I think he says something like, "Only a little one." And that's it. And they literally put a thing in the New York Times sort of saying, We don't believe that the use of just one word could result in the sale of tens of thousands of copies. It's great and backhanded kind of, no, this isn't true at all. And of course it is. And it really helped the sales of the book. Now, absolutely. And it's one of the things that makes you know that this is still Dashiell Hammett, basically, I think, that there is a tougher element to the story. And in fact, Nick Charles, as he is in the films, isn't quite the Nick Charles of the book, because in the book, Charles is in fact an Americanization. He's actually a Greek, which actually partly explains why Nikki is seen as a bit of an outsider, whereas Nora, of course, comes from high society, and they sort of rejecting her choice of husband. But he is, of course, is a first-class detective, and they have a wonderful sort of sparring relationship, which some people think was probably to a large extent built on the relationship between Dashiell Hammett and Lillian Hellman, who were very, very close at the time, and that would remain close on and off for well over 30 years. In the film, the story is about a missing, industrialist, I suppose, who is actually the eponymous Thin Man. It's not Nick Charles. It's actually this chap who is making himself very unpopular with members of his family. So again, classic kind of whodunit idea. And then he goes missing. And his daughter, who's played by Maureen O'Sullivan, gets hold of Nick, who she finds in a bar, because the Volstead Act had only recently been revoked, and so you could go out and actually buy drinks legally. And so he's having many, many, many cocktails.
I was standing at the bar of the Ritz one day, reaching for an olive, when a very pretty girl suddenly popped up in front of me and said,
Hello there.
Hello. Another glass. How are you?
You know, we do know each other.
Certainly, we've known each other for years.
Aren't you Nick Charles?
Huh?
You don't remember me? I'm Dorothy Wynant.
How is your father?
Oh, that's what I came to ask you. He's disappeared.
So you have to go and find the Thin Man. But then the story completely changes, because who comes in and goes flat on her face? But it's Nora, who is walking their dog Asta into the bar, having been to the shops, and she's got lots of presents and things, and falls right over. And then they have a chat about just how many drinks he's had, and she wants to have exactly as many drinks as he's having, which is great. I mean, how many times have you guys seen the Thin Man movie, do you think?
Many, many, many. But I used to teach it as well, so I would watch it with students.
In what context?
Sort of classical narrative. Basically, you know, it's such a very well constructed, tight, superbly well put together film, and it encompasses all those essential aspects of how Hollywood told stories. It's a great way of teaching all of those elements of plotting and structure. But also, it's fun. It's fun. It's sharp and it's modern. It's an extremely efficient film. It was directed by Woody Van Dyke, W.S. Van Dyke, One Take Woody, as he was known.
Yes.
And you can just tell this is somebody who, it's not about flair, it's not about authorial, putting an authorial stamp on a story. It's about telling the story as efficiently and as well as absolutely possible. And going back to the idea of noir, yes, it's before noir, the noir period technically, but there are nuggets of it all the way throughout. You know, you've got a femme fatale who's sort of there, well, two or three actually, because it's a very complicated plot. The very first shot of the film, over the credits, is the Thin Man, and it's a silhouette. You know, it's the light and dark. There's a wonderful scene, the guy who goes missing, Wygand, in his warehouse or whatever. They're walking down this kind of dark corridor, and it's very kind of chiaroscuro. That sort of thing is in there as well. What it doesn't have, I think, what it misses from noir is that sense of kind of fatalism, that sort of darkness to it. This is a very light and upbeat film. And of all the ones, with maybe one exception, I think of all the films that we're talking about this afternoon, I think this is the one which makes the most use of Christmas. There's a wonderful, completely unnecessary but beautiful scene where it's Christmas morning and Nick and Nora have unwrapped all their presents. And Nora's bought Nick a BB gun, and he's just sitting there kind of firing it at the balloons on the Christmas tree. And it's one of those things, while this is going on, they're having conversations, the plot is moving forward. It's not an irrelevant scene, but it's just a lovely piece of business to keep the audience visually occupied while, what it's like with these stories, you have to have the conversation that talks about, but then there's this clue, but then so-and-so went over here, and what about this and all that. And rather than an info dump, they kind of use Christmas. So there's this wonderful Christmas party that Nick and Nora throw for all of his clients. And all of his clients are there. And of course, all of his clients are kind of low-life criminals. So the whole room is full of bare-knuckle boxers and gangsters and things like that. And it's just hilarious.
Yeah. It's very whimsical
Yeah.
in that respect. It's using all of that as a backdrop that's very whimsical and fun. And what I quite like about, again, the Christmas location or a setting creates the scenario of why they're in New York, because they're on a Christmas vacation. The implication is they're fairly recently married, and this is her coming back to his city, being introduced to his world, which is why he invites all these characters. And you see how much Nora is drawn to this world. So I like the Christmas setting, because it creates a space where they do have these kind of relaxed moments. They're on vacation and they're having a good time. And okay, they never need an excuse to drink, but there's a backdrop to that, particularly for the first one, of why they're like sitting in bars drinking endless rows of martinis. And I think there's something really nice about this idea that this is Nora, who is, as you say, a socialite, comes from a very kind of privileged background, realizing that she's much more at home in these scenarios, wants to be part of the investigation. As much as she tries to stop her or kind of hive her off or send her off somewhere else, she keeps coming back to the investigation. And I think that it's a really nice kind of use of Christmas to kind of bring her into this world where she belongs. She really belongs there. She suits this space, even if at a glance it seems incongruous.
I mean, I think that incongruity in a way is also just built in, isn't it? Which is one of the fascinating things about the film, because on the one hand, you have traditional kind of mystery. On the other hand, he comes from a hard-boiled background, and there's an element of everybody wants to maybe tame him a little bit, but actually Nora really doesn't. She likes him just the way he is, in fact. And then you get the kind of the cops come in, and they're the typical, flat-footed people, and they turn in, and there's this bit where they come and ransack their apartment, and you get the kind of classic joke where he says, "What's that man doing in my drawers?" Stuff like that. So it's got the nice repartee and the things that you tend to associate maybe just a little bit with Screwball. So you're going from this idea of Screwball into crime into noir, which is one of the ideas that I find most exciting about the way that noir sort of developed, is that it came out of that inevitable contrast that was part of the Depression between the haves and the have-nots. So here it's sort of built in. You've got the rich socialite and the hardworking regular guy, and it's the contrast between them, and they found a perfect symbiosis because they have this wonderful, loving, humorous relationship. I think the humor's crucial to it. At the same time, and we've talked about this in the past, of course, is one of the interesting things about the film is that it looks a little atypical for an MGM movie of 1934, and it's partly to do with the fact that it actually feels a lot more like a Warner Brothers movie of 1934. And that's because William Powell had just been nicked over from Warner Brothers, who in turn they had stolen him from Paramount. And at Paramount, he'd been Fellow Vance, and they brought him over to Warner Brothers and made another Fellow Vance movie. And here he's going to be another sleuth. He's going to be Nick Charles, who was, on the bestseller list. So it's this odd mix that works so well. I think the fact that there was this kind of mistaken association between the Thin Man and Nick Charles, and actually it's just the victim in the first film, and then you've got 5 films afterwards and a TV show, not to mention rip-offs like the otherwise thoroughly charming Heart to Heart, which is just Thin Man by another name, credited to Sidney Sheldon. They keep using the label, and yet it's got nothing to do with William Powell, as Leslie Halliwell once said, he wasn't that thin. And he got less and less thin as the series progressed, because of course the series went on for another 13 years. In actual fact, I always think the second film, which is it Another Thin Man? After the Thin Man, I always get it wrong, which is perhaps almost as good, if not as good as the first one, except it looks and feels a little bit more MGM-y by this point. It's glossier, it's a lot longer.
I also think that change in style works because one of the things, as I say, I think the Thin Man is about her entering his world. But after the Thin Man, is much more they return to California. And it's now him in her world. So that kind of glossier look, that MGM look kind of works for the last.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that's intentional, but it actually, for me, it actually really works very well to suddenly you're seeing him having to solve a case on behalf of these socialites. It's their world that there's a crisis. And
Well,
he's kind of-
absolutely, yeah, because in New York, it's kind of a nice apartment, but you go back to San Francisco, and it's this gigantic palatial home that they have. And so when they have a party there, which they have not organized, it's enormous and just rammed full of people, and it's very funny.
Yeah.
And although it would be rude to mention it, one of the things that makes it feel perhaps even the teensy-weensy bit noir is, of course, is the way that they handle the reveal of the villain, which somehow feels a little more noirish. We won't say any more.
Oh, no.
Because people should go watch it because it's a great second film.
While we're briefly mentioning sort of rip-offs, you're quite right about Heart to Heart, which, interesting enough, has a tie into a film that we're going to be talking about a bit later on.
Yes.
But I also want to shout out for Murder by Death, the Neil Simon film from 1978,
Right.
which has Dick and Dora Charleston.
Yes. 1975.
No.
1975. Chief Detective is 1978.
Okay. Dick and Dora Charleston, brilliantly played by David Niven and the late Maggie Smith, who's having an absolute whale of a time. And it's a film that has aged poorly, if for no other reason. Peter Sellers playing Sidney Wang, the Chinese detective, which is a tad toe-curling now. But it is a film in which all of these famous versions of all these famous detectives kind of come together to solve a murder in the house of Truman Capote. And you've got Peter Falk as doing Humphrey Bogart. You've got James Coco doing
Poirot.
kind of a Poirot character.
Elsa Lanchester.
And Elsa Lanchester.
Sparple.
Yeah, and it's aged poorly, and the jokes don't always land, but it is quite fun. And certainly the highlight of it are David Niven and Maggie Smith, who's just having so much fun.
I don't understand. Why would anybody want to steal a dead, naked body?
Well, dear, there are people who...
Oh, that's tacky. That's really tacky.
We're doing this chronologically. We're going to look at half a dozen films. And one of the films that I thought would be good to pick is Christmas Holiday from 1944, which stars Diana Durbin and Gene Kelly. The big selling point of that film was, apart from them, was the use of Irving Berlin's song Always, which gets a very prominent credit. It's heard on the soundtrack, and she gets to sing songs in it. It's like Universal is doing everything they can to make you think that this is going to be a romantic musical. And you watch this darn thing, and it's the darkest of noir films imaginable. And it was part of amending the image of Diana Durbin, who, of course, had been the child star that saved Universal Studios, and who was now older and playing adult roles. And here is playing... Well, she's what she's referred to as she's a dancer. Basically, she's a prostitute. We start with this and with the story of a serviceman who's on his way home, and he gets caught in between trains, as it were, because this is 1944. It's during the war, and this is a film directed by Robert Siodmak, who did most of the great noir films of the 1940s. Let's face it. He ends up staying in New Orleans and sort of gets talking to this rather unhappy lady played by Diana Durbin, who's had a hard life. And ultimately they go to a Christmas service.
Yeah.
And then she sort of relates her tale of woe. So we get the classic flashback structure. The screenwriting credit is Herman J. Mankiewicz, who had co-written Citizen Kane and got an Oscar for it. And it's an adaptation of a novel by Somerset Maugham. It's an extremely broad adaptation of the novel of the same title by Somerset Maugham, which was actually set around the kind of White Russians in Paris in the 1930s. Hence, I think the New Orleans atmosphere, perhaps, because it's not Paris, but it's sort of Frenchish. We get this story about how she meets this guy played by Gene Kelly, falls in love, they get married, and Gail Sondergaard plays his mum. Gail Sondergaard, who's about the same age as Gene Kelly, I think. Okay, I'll have to come clean on this one, and I made a slight mistake there. Gail Sondergaard was actually born in 1899. Gene Kelly was born in 1912. So she was, in fact, 13 years older than him. There. Now, back to the program. And she's great in it, by the way. She was always getting landed with roles like that. It's infuriating. You know, a brilliant actress of the 40s who then got sadly sidelined because of the witch hunt in the 1950s. It's a very, very peculiar film because the look of it is exceptionally noirish. It looks amazing. Shot by Woody Bredell. He and Soderbergh were going to make The Killers a couple of years later. So it looks fantastic. Diane Durbin is very sort of made up, very much an adult role, and so her appearance is quite changed from the kind of wholesome image, I suppose, that she'd had up until that point, so that it's quite a stark contrast. So you're seeing something very different. And it turned out that Gene Kelly is, in the book, the problem between the couple is that the husband's really gay. In the film, they make him the next best thing, mother dominated. I mean, what do you two think of that film overall? At least how they handle that relationship.
It was an interesting one to watch. I think going back to Deanna Durbin, one of the things that I thought was really interesting is that they make her up. She looks very different in the quote unquote contemporary scenes than she does in the flashback.
Yes.
There's a real difference in her look, which I think is very impressive. You really get the sense of a woman who's struggled and suffered.
Yeah, it's a fallen woman story.
Yeah.
And we're seeing the fall.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. Suddenly I felt uncomfortable saying the word fallen woman. So thanks for stepping in. It's okay if you do it.
Well, it's not her fault. She's completely innocent. She does, and it's one of the interesting things. Again, one of the slightly odd things about it, because she's completely innocent, and yet at the same time, she seems to be carrying the burden and the guilt.
Yeah.
And it's thrust upon her. The scenes between her and the mother are quite devastating. And the mother saying, "It's your fault. It's you." And yet she seems to take that on board, despite the fact it is absolutely not her fault. And if you're going to blame someone other than Gene Kelly, which, let's be honest, he's the one we should blame.
Well, yeah.
But the mother is obviously implicated in having indulged him.
I mean, we should say up front, I don't think it's a spoiler. In the film, he ultimately kills someone. And the mother and, I suppose, ever so slightly Diana Durbin, they sort of cover up for him because the mother is so relentless in protecting him and dealing with him as if he's just done a naughty thing, which is really not the case. And of course, he's one of these people who is completely feckless, unreliable. He's charming. He's Gene Kelly. But you know what? He's a selfish little so-and-so, and he's not helping anybody except himself, and not doing a very good job of doing that either.
Yeah.
Then we get to, obviously, the darker part of the story, and ultimately he goes to jail, and then he's going to break out of jail, and he's going to come visit.
And when he comes visit, he hasn't shaved, and that's when you know he's a really bad guy.
He's a bad guy, right?
Oh, yeah. He's not the Gene Kelly we know. He's Gene Kelly with beard. It's like Star Trek.
Yes, exactly. Evil spot with a greaser.
It's got this wraparound story about this airman who he's supposed to go home and get engaged, and gets this telegram saying, "Hey, I've married George. He's much better than you," and he's going to go back to San Francisco and do something, confront them. He's mad. And so the tale of the film, the tale that she tells him, the wraparound story is how it impacts upon him, etc. And I like the film, but I don't think that the wraparound story is strong compared to the rest of it. It feels a bit like a device to get the story told.
Yeah.
It doesn't have kind of a deeper resonance. I think that was my main kind of critique of it.
Yeah, my only, and I know what you mean, although I quite like the airman. I think there's something, he's a good foil, but what the sequence I do really like is when they go to the Christmas Mass. It's cliche. She goes to Christmas Mass and she has this kind of cathartic moment of crying. And then she says, "I'm not crying because of what you think." It's not that she's like feeling guilty, right? Like, or not, it's not like some discovery or reawakening or something. But I think it's this beautiful moment. I'm listening to the choir, listening to music, and then she cries. And it's because of this doomed love story. And so I do think that moment is beautiful. And her performance is really great in that sequence, I think, because it, as you say, this at this point, this is not the Diane Derman that we know. We're seeing her; she's quite different and enigmatic. Like you often get femme fatales in noir, but actually, I really like that our entry point is an enigmatic woman, and it's her story we're hearing, whereas often it is the male character who is recounting his story. And I really do like that moment is there. And I agree with you. It is a wraparound story. It's just to get to the tragic love affair. But I do think there's something quite beautiful about this moment where you just get to see her. And it makes sense why she would then tell her story, because she has had this cathartic cry, which he has kind of protected her from. Like he has kind of stood and, kept people from gawking at her.
I mean, because in the film, obviously, you have this, on the one hand, you could sort of say, well, it's an analog for what you get in the novel, which is one of those things that happened a lot in Somerset Maugham novels, where it's as told too. So your entry point into the story is a version of Maugham himself, or, in the films of The Razor's Edge and Moon and Sixpence, you've actually got Herbert Marshall basically playing Somerset Maugham and the Stolby, which I always thought was quite amusing. And in this case, it's also because it's during the war. So in a way, he's the kind of identification figure, except it's kind of like, is he going to do something wrong, and he's going to pull back from that because he's confronted with a situation where someone else had something bad happen to them, and he has a chance to reflect. And because Diana Derman is very much, it's a film about her, she has the most interesting trajectory. It would have been great if you'd found out a bit more about Gail Sondergaard. It actually would have been quite interesting if we got a better access to what the hell's going on in Gene Kelly's head as well. Even Richard Wolff, who's playing a kind of Herman J. Mankiewicz analog, a kind of sort of journalist type. And the truth is, it's a good role for her from that point of view, absolutely, because I think you get to see her in these two different time zones, the flashback period and the way things are now. And you do want to find out how this is going to resolve itself. You sort of worry that how bleak is this going to get because it's noir. That's sort of interesting, isn't it? It's kind of like this idea that when even Diana Derban has to be in a noir, that means noir has really become a main or important factor in the Hollywood way of telling stories. And it's always interesting who turns up. So when Mickey Rooney suddenly does a noir, well, yeah, noir's obviously a thing. We look at this as a kind of an interesting experiment, which she didn't repeat. I mean, after this, the next one she did, which is a very minor noir, but which is actually a good laugh, which is Lady on a Train, which is considered noir, but it's a comedy thriller. Talking about women under pressure, we swiftly move along to the next film on our list, which is a film that I think we all really think is superb. We've had a couple which are sort of either on the margins or which are kind of feeling their way towards something. But the film that we're talking about now is The Reckless Moment, which is Max Ophuls' film from 1949, which actually has a top-billed James Mason, plays a not nice guy who tries to be nice. He's sort of a blackmailer involved in criminal activities. And Joan Bennett, who, of course, is one of the main actresses who we associate with noir in the 1940s, primarily because of several films she made with Fritz Lang, including Manhunt, Woman in the Window, Scarlet Street, and Secret Behind the Door, which are all made with Lang through the company that they set up together with her husband, producer Walter Wanger. And this was another one of the films that Walter Wanger set up. So I think she had a fair amount of control of what was going on in the film. I think it still works superbly. Based on a book by a writer, Elizabeth Sangsay Holding, who isn't particularly well known, but it was called The Blank Wall, which is what they filmed it as. But I think The Reckless Moment is probably a slightly better title. I think Blank Wall sounds a little bit austere. Well, what's it about?
The story is about a mother of borderline adult, 17, 18-year-old daughter. I love that she's in art school.
Yes.
She's living on the edge. She's in art school. And she's basically fallen in with a different crowd and gotten involved with someone who is older and considered quite dubious and revealed to be quite dubious. And the mother doesn't approve. And the mother confronts him, and he's clearly tries to stop this relationship, then confronts her daughter and says, you can't see him anymore. So what does the daughter do, of course? But sneak out in the middle of the night to see him. And that encounter doesn't go well. It becomes apparent that he's, interested in her because of the money he might get from her parents to keep him away. She lashes out.
Yeah, she smacks him on the head,
Yeah.
runs away, and he sort of staggers and sort of falls off.
He falls off the balcony of the boathouse and lands on an anchor.
Yes.
An anchor which happens to be unfortunately just lying there and impales himself.
Impaled.
Dies.
So it is both a reckless moment, and it's kind of a great film to think about which of the many things that happen in this film is the reckless moment. It then follows the mother who then just tries to cover up and then is blackmailed because of this relationship with the daughter. And
Because the daughter's written these compromising letters, hasn't she, which have ended up in the hands of this sort of gangster figure, and James Mason works with him.
Yeah.
And was it Mr. Nagel?
Mr. Nate.
And James Mason is sort of seems to be playing the same Irishman from Odd Man Out, basically. So he's doing an okay Irish accent, I guess. And he says, oh, you don't want to mess with Mr. Nagel. Okay, I can't do an Irish accent, obviously. But in fact, one of the great things about that film is that it starts right away in the middle of the story.
Yeah.
First scene is Joan Bennett gets in the car, drives to, they live in Balboa, which is about, 50 miles out of Los Angeles then, and is in fact an incredibly ritzy neighborhood. Drives off to LA so that she can meet up with this guy and tell him to leave her daughter alone. And she's completely confident. And in a way, it's kind of great because she's doing the classic maternal thing. After all, you're protecting your family. Has absolutely no doubts at all about what's going on here. She sees him for what it is. She's actually not particularly judgmental, because then you do get this, what I think is a terrific scene between her and the daughter, where the daughter's sort of been in the shower and she sort of comes out. And one of the interesting things is, again, she's quite mean to the domestic, and Joan Bennett says to her, don't talk to her like that.
Yeah.
Which I thought was a really nice scene, especially because of the way that the story ultimately plays out with the two of them together. She then goes and talks to him, and the daughter is, it's one of those things, I dare say a lot of mothers have had this situation where the daughter is, she literally is, we're told she's like 17, about to be 18, but she just assumes that her mum doesn't understand, is old, can't possibly understand what she's going through. Although I think Joan Bennett was like 38 at the time or something, ancient. It's so well done, and it's sort of like, oh my God, so I think it's totally, totally plausible. I think in a horrible way.
Yeah.
But, there's the roots of kind of all kinds of psychodrama.
Yeah. The daughter, she plays her beautifully because she both plays her as a kind of petulant child and a teenager who does think she is grown up. And she has this wonderful moment when she's saying, like the mother says, I know what it's like. I was, 17 once too. I understand these things. She says, yes, but 17-year-olds today know the score. And it's just that sense, just that sense that she is so much like more mature, and that she very quickly is revealed to be someone who is a teenager, and she doesn't know what to do. And the mother has to step up to try to protect her. And that, of course, just keeps leading her down this problematic route.
You're absolutely right. But what's interesting is that the main criminal that she encounters, which is James Mason, you have this wonderful opening scene with him where he turns up at the house and he tells her about the letters, and he says, pay me $5,000, which I assume is probably about $60,000 or $70,000 now. It's a lot of money. And she's like, I don't have it. So, well, you've got to get it. And interspersed with this, you've got this wonderful sort of family business. There's a son in the film who is never dressed. He's either wearing a shirt and no pants, or he's hasn't got his shirt on, and she's constantly saying, will you get dressed? So they're having this tense scene, and he walks through kind of in his underpants, and she says, what are you doing? And he says, I've got trunks on, and then
Women's trunks, in fairness.
Yeah. But it looks like underpants because he's in the distance, right?
Yeah.
And then he starts talking about dinner, and he's like, who's this guy? Is he staying for dinner? And then the old man, the father, comes in, and he's like, oh, you're from Ireland? Oh, I love Ireland. Why don't you stay for a whiskey and all this kind of... You get this, what could be quite a cold scene, with this intimidating criminal who seems to be wonderfully bemused by all of this activity and quite warm to it, and very quickly starts to become someone who's more interested in helping her than hurting her, and sort of confused and conflicted in terms of his relationship. And Mason does that really, really well. If I'm correct, this is one of the 3 first films he made when he went to Hollywood from England. But before he kind of hit the big time in the early 1950s. And you can see the legacy of those kind of Gainsborough performances that he gives in those classic British films of the 40s. But here it's all dialed down, it's much more muted, it's much quieter, but you still see that attractiveness that he had. Joan Bennett is fantastic in the film. She holds the whole thing together. He is this quiet support who's not only supporting her as a character, but as an actor is really just kind of like taking the backseat and letting her run with the film and just doing what needs to be done in order to support her performance. They make a very good double act.
They do. Absolutely.
No, and as you say, it's quite nicely underplayed. And the daughter's played by Geraldine Brooks, and she was 24 at the time. So she was only 15 years younger than Joan Bennett. And I think they're all playing it in a very naturalistic way for the most part. And it really pays off. You get these very plausible, realistic portrayals. I think that, Joan Bennett, you believe right from the get-go that this is a kind of like a real person, how they would behave. You kind of need to have that because there are some aspects of it that obviously become a little bit more contrived in the sense that the crux of the plot is that she happens to go out one morning and is worried about her daughter, goes out for a walk, goes to the beach, and there's nobody else on the beach, and it's played as a big suspense scene, but finds that body. And obviously she's worried that her daughter has actually basically just killed him, actually. She's just going to protect her daughter, and she has to sort of drag the body over to this boat and is going to dump his body. And so it's a long sequence. Originally, apparently, it was shot in a single take. And the feeling is that it didn't really work. But everything else it's a dummy, which she's dragging. And I think it sort of was a bit too obvious that it was in these, you had so much time to look at it because there's no cutting, that it became obvious that it wasn't, shall we say, a thespian. At that point, she then has to, she's very determined, she's doing all these things to protect her daughter, and there's this whole subplot that the family is slightly disunited because her husband isn't there because he's unexpectedly had to go to Berlin, had to leave the country. He's not even just sort of not in Southern California. He's actually out of the country. So he's off doing that. So he's unavailable. But equally, it means that some of the ways that, shall we say, things would have been organized within the household are a little bit like this. And so everybody's perhaps acting out a bit in the sense that they're in their own way taking advantage of things. It's a holiday. It's Christmas, and it's Christmas and New Year, and so everybody's feeling the spirit, as it were, and a lot of it is in real time. So again, feels very organic, and I think for the performances, that approach really benefits the way that the film develops, because some aspects of it are just the usual contrivances of these kinds of storylines. One of the nice things to me is the way that you get suspense out of everyday things, banal things. One of the best scenes in the film is when Joan Bennett and James Mason have to go to the shops.
Yeah.
It's bizarre. She's there in the car with this guy who's blackmailing her, or wants to blackmail her. He hasn't actually gotten any money out of her yet because she says, I can't get any money. It's the holidays. The bank is shut. And then, of course, you get one of those very interesting scenes that made me think of Dolores Claiborne, where, she tries to hawk some of her jewelry and get her things, but she would have to use the house as collateral. And that's either in her name or jointly in the name of her and her husband. And therefore, he would have to co-sign, but which leaves her with just so few options. And so she feels trapped. And so that escalation, but you get this scene when they just go to the shops. It's a great scene because it's this kind of, they're falling into this kind of automatic roles a little bit because there's an element of sympathy. that he feels sorry for her and he doesn't really want to be doing this. We don't know why, actually, but we know that he's not really enjoying being a blackmailer. He'd rather be doing something else with his life. He sort of says to her, "You smoke too much."
Yeah.
It's like a hilarious moment. And so he gets her one of those whole filter things, so that she can, you don't inhale as much of the tobacco, and just adds it to her shopping, but pays for it himself, which is bizarre and actually sweet. It shouldn't, you just don't expect to get that in a film like this. And I think it's those touches. And then you get to the big climax. And one of the things that I think is so successful about the film, and which I think really makes it stand out, is that it's her and the maid, played by Frances E. Williams, and it's them together. They're going to save the day. They're going to fix this problem, and they go off and do it. And it's like a car chase, and then they're the ones doing the driving. They take turns, and they're in complete harmony about this. And it's actually, again, it's just so unusual, and so welcome.
Yeah. The maid character is, it's a really fresh presence in there. And she appears, as you say, in the first scene with the daughter being really rude to her. And what I like is that when James Mason turns up, she kind of recognizes him for what he is. Like, there's a man in the house, but, she's brought him into the living room, but she knows he's different. Like, there's something. So it lets her know. But she sort of sees him. When Nagel turns up at the end, she completely recognizes him for what he is and leaves him in the boathouse and takes him out because he shouldn't be in the house. And I quite like that. And that she says, "Do you want me to come out with you? Do you want me to?" There's something about her, someone, and these two women working together who recognize these men. And when they're in the car, not only is she helping, but she also is saying, "Look, this is why he's done this. He can't go to the police." The mother wants to go to the police and confess everything. But the maid is the one who says, "But no, that won't work because he will be arrested. Like, the Mason character will be arrested. They won't believe your story." And I really like that she has this real sense of recognition. They have a good relationship that they can talk about this, and she can guide, and they can work together. And I love that she sees in a way that the grandfather and the son don't. They think he's lovely, and they're just all walking around. They recognize, they know something's going on because the mother's keeps disappearing, and but they're at the same time,
There's no like the boy's too young and the father's too old.
Father-in-law, yeah, like they're just off doing. They know something's going on, but they're not really interacting. And the maid and the daughter is, of course, still like crying in the bedroom. So but it's the maid these two women who work together, have respect for each other, and who are working together in the end. And I really like that. And I love the scene with Nagel, where I think it's just the way she immediately clocks him for who he is and what he is.
Yeah, but then again, we've sort of been warned about him, of course, because because she says this, "Oh, I bet it's just you. I don't think there's this Nagel at all." Says, "There is a Nagel, and you really don't want to get involved with him. Trust me, you want to deal with me." It's true. It's true. And that's the thing, is that in his own way, he's trying to sort of be fair about this. Look, this is not nice, but we reckon you can afford it because you live in this really ritzy part of town. Then there's this whole thing, because it's kind of, is the wrong person going to get accused of the crime?
Yeah.
And they kind of slightly sidestep that side of it, of course, because that would have been really turning the screws. And obviously, there's an element of this. How far would she actually go to protect her daughter, who is, shall we say, but was protecting herself? It was self-defense. She didn't deliberately aim to throw him on top of, this kind of nasty implement that happened to be there in the beach. But yeah, it's a superb movie. I think probably deserves to be slightly better known, and absolutely, kind of crucial stepping stone for Mason in making that transition from, shall we say, British heartthrob in bodice rippers to Hollywood star. Really,
just the last thing I'll say about him is we really see the line he walks between charm and menace, and how easily he can move back and forth between the two.
So moving away from California, super Californian Christmas noir, to a very chilly East Coast noir. To tell us a little bit about Blast of Silence from 1961.
Super low budget film, shot on the streets of New York without permits. So it's a very kind of guerrilla filmmaking. And this is not necessarily the film itself, but if you watch the trailer for the film, it looks like somebody watched Breathless and went, let's do that. It's got this kind of whole sort of Godardian thing all over it.
You're going to be party to an attempt to kill a man. This is the asphalt jungle. This is New York City, with its fancy women and fancy hoodlums, with its very special beat, its very special places, its hunters and hunted. And you will walk side by side with Frankie Bono as he stalks his prey, knowing what is in his mind, feeling what is in his heart. And your hands will sweat with his fear. Your pulse will pound with his desire.
In a way, thankfully, the film actually isn't like that. The trailer seems to suggest it's something else. But you have a hitman, is from New York, left New York, earned a lot of money wandering around killing people, comes back to New York to do a job. It follows the preparation for it. So it's, he follows the mark. He goes to all the places where the mark goes, looking for the best place in order to be able to walk up to this guy and shoot him. And in the course of this, he ends up meeting some of the people that he used to know, which does that wonderful existentialist thing. It starts him sort of thinking about his problematic life choices. Gradually, the film becomes more and more existentialist and more fatalistic as it goes along until you reach the climax, which is all kind of based around this job that he has to do, this assassination. It's an odd film. It's a good film. It's odd. The first thing it reminded me of, in a very obscure way, was Blade Runner, because the film has this very, very long, very detailed, slightly anachronistic voiceover that accompanies all the action. I don't know if this is the case, but it looks as if they made the film, cut it all together and went, no one can figure out what the hell's going on. No, let's have a voiceover.
That's exactly what happened. It was not part of the original script, and they brought in Waldo Salt, who was still blacklisted, and he had to write it to the finished film.
So what you get with this voiceover, which is done by another blacklisted actor, Lionel Sandler, the great Lionel Sandler, who was the press agent in the original and best version of A Star Is Born, and most famously was the butler or driver in Heart to Heart. He does this kind of grisly, growly voiceover, and it's all first/third person. So he's telling you what you're thinking as if you're the main character in the film. So it's like you wake up in the morning, you look out the window, it's dark, it's greasy, you don't want to be there, but you know you've got to do the job. And it's very strange and very, very detailed. I think the film would probably work better without it, but it then becomes this almost like an experiment in storytelling, kind of listening to this narrative, which ends up with becoming fascinating in and of itself. And I'm deliberately not mentioning the lead actor at this point, who's also the director, because I cannot remember what his name is.
Alan Barron.
Alan Barron, yes, Alan Barron. So Alan Barron is the director and like the instigator behind the whole project, and he plays the hitman. Originally, the role was supposed to be played by his friend Peter Falk. I mean, this was a very low-budget film, and I think Peter Falk got a real paying job in Murder, Inc.
That's right, yeah.
And quite rightly, no. So Barron takes on the role, and he's okay, but he doesn't quite have the chops to sort of really pull it off. He's kind of aiming for a sort of Alain Delon in The Samurai, which presumably is after this, but it's that kind of thing. But he doesn't quite make it. He looks sort of slightly puzzled and a bit fed up from time to time, but he doesn't quite get existentialist angst nailed down right. But it's a real labor of love. It's got a terrific jazz score. New York looks astonishing in it. You know, the guerrilla shooting on the streets, it does have an element of Godard's Breathless to it in this location shooting, slightly down and dirty. And the lead character's really quite nasty.
Yeah, I mean, it's set during Christmas and leading up to New Year. So it's ultra Christmassy. And the central dynamic of the film is between the location shooting, because there's a little bit of studio work, but this literally cost just over $20,000, right? So it was done by friends and family over several months, I think, bits and bobs of shooting here and there. You get some wonderful shots of New York, like you say. There's this brilliant bit where it's essentially, I think, a van that they've got slightly disguised so it doesn't look, so you can't see the cameraman inside. And there's this wonderful sequence when they go around Rockefeller Plaza and the camera is just following him around. So you get these fantastic shots of the big tree and all the lights, and they go on for quite a long time, but it's never boring. Because that part of the existentialism of it works very well. The voiceover has some startling moments, none probably more startling than the opening bit, where they literally use a shot from inside the train. I mean, in the story, he's coming from Cleveland and he's coming to New York. And you see the train coming far, far away from inside a tunnel, coming out the tunnel, and then he gets out, stops off at the station, and, and the voiceover, which is Lionel Stander's super gravelly voice, as you say, and he marries this image to the idea of being born. So it's as if this tunnel is like the birth canal, which is extraordinary image to go for.
Remembering, out of the black silence, you were born in pain. Easy does it, little mother. We've never lost a father. Your job is done, little mother.
And yet actually fits the film because he is this angry, lonely, unhappy, dissatisfied, but to some extent somewhat deluded character. There are these wonderful bits where he sort of says, I could have been an engineer. I could have been an architect. Except it's not I, it's always he could have. So you get this, so it's almost like it's his conscience or something is speaking. It's that part of his brain that is sort of pushing it. And he gets this motivational voiceover from somewhere, but it's filled with bile mostly, and it gets a bit repetitive. And so ultimately you're thinking, I wish there were less of this. And yet at the same time, it's very distinctive. It does give it a kind of poetic sensibility that matches, I think, the imagery, which is so impressive. I mean, some of it isn't brilliantly shot, but mostly, considering the circumstances, it actually looks fabulous, I think. And then you get the big climax, which we were remarking on because it's very windy and gusty and rainy here today where we're recording. And when they were filming that, there was basically a hurricane off Jamaica Bay, which is where they shot it. It completely overwhelms the characters. I mean, and it's just part of the film. So it's this kind of godlike intervention almost. And it's almost like the voiceover is almost God or the devil or whoever. It's this omniscient third party that's telling us things that maybe we don't need. But at the same time, as you say, I think that they probably needed something to bring it all together because rhythmically it does add something. And Waldo Salt was an interesting writer. So he put some interesting things together.
It does work because, I mean, as you say, it's got this Christmas setting. What it brings to life is this essential idea that he is a loner. And Christmas is obviously the ultimate time of not being alone, of being with family and being with friends and social activities and so on and so forth. And there's always that sense of it's the worst time to be on your own. And the essence of the film is this idea that I'm a loner, or he's a loner. The voiceover gets confusing in that regard. Is it me? Is it he? And it's that push-pull between there's a possibility that I don't have to be a loner anymore, but I am a loner. Do I want to not be a loner anymore? There's this whole thing. The voiceover keeps saying, here's one of the danger moments. And the danger moment is always when he has to meet somebody. And he's not alone, because when he's alone, he can trust himself. So the essential aspect of the film is a push-pull between those two elements. And obviously that's integral to the end. And I think that the voiceover does really help to kind of draw that out. I think that's one of those things that would be quite hard to just get if you were watching the film without it. It really kind of beds it in. And just to talk about the end, I mean, it's so bonkers. There's a long shot, not in the sense of time, but in the sense of distance, at the end where they're walking to wherever the payoff is supposed to take place. And you can clearly see that it's bloody windy and miserable. I'm looking at this going, why didn't you come back the next day? You could have done that. But no, they decided to go with it. And it does give this sort of titanic pathos to that kind of final scene, that it should be happening in this catastrophic sort of windstorm, which I really like. And it's one of those sort of mad touches that the film has,
Yeah.
which is very, very effective.
Well, in fact, it turns out that the first time they went to shoot it, they had the best sun ever for 4 days running. And they said, no, I want this grey. So then they waited, came back and the weather was bad, only it was really, really bad. And they said, you know what, we're going to make the most of it. But it was that was what was happening behind the scenes. It's a very successful film of its type. But also, yeah, it's sort of barely 80 minutes, and I think probably just as well, because I think there's only so much story. I mean, it's this interesting subgenre, the kind of the hitman existential angst noir. And there's a couple that precede this, actually. I think probably things like This Gun for Hire with Alan Ladd, Murder by Contract. But they're the only ones I can readily think of that really go for this idea. And then obviously you get so many more, usually starring Alain Delon. David Fincher just did one with The Killer. You know, these things have traction, they have legs. So it's sort of important to think of it in terms of its place historically. I think it's fascinating. I think it has had a certain relevance from that point of view. I think people have seen it and been impressed.
I think absolutely. What struck me watching the film was that here is a really super low budget film, obviously a labor of love made by smart people. It seems, because 1961, it doesn't seem to be at the tail end of something, it seems to be at the forefront of something. But then absolutely it is the forerunner of Melville and all the way through to The Jackal, the TV series, which is on at the moment, you know, the lone kind of hitman. And it seems to be very much a kind of foreshadowing of some of the best aspects of that idea of showing the emptiness of this life. You got money, but of course he says he's in the top 5% earners in America. He earns a lot of money. You never see him do anything with any money. You never see him anywhere that looks like he's well off. So his whole life is just miserable.
And I think there is this fascinating subtext, isn't this whole idea of he was brought up in an orphanage, he had this terrible childhood, he doesn't want to go back to New York, he's really afraid of what that will bring out in him.
Yes.
And that sort of anger and fear is what drives him. I think that's just so unusual.
But what going back to New York brings out in him is the humanity's lost by being a hitman outside of New York all these years.
And which means he can't really do his job.
Which means he can't. And at one point he rings up and says, I don't want to do it anymore. And they say, no. We told you to kill this guy. Go kill this guy. And the lead character's name, the central character, is Frankie Bono.
Yes.
And the voiceover keeps going, so here you are, Frankie Bono. And it's great. It becomes this sort of like an earworm all the way through the film. Like Frankie Bono. I really enjoyed it. I didn't think I would because the trailer is so bad.
Yeah, I don't know if it's the original trailer or a re-release.
It's hard to tell. It's certainly a trailer from around the time.
I mean, Barron is very clear about it in terms of, they were shooting, I think, in 60, and then in 61 they sold the rights to Universal for $50,000. They sold it as one package. Made a bit of money off it, and that was it. They never expected anybody to take any notice. The person who's been noticeably absent from talking about this film is Stacey, because she hasn't seen it.
I know.
So therefore, I think it's only right that we now leap forward about 17 years to The Silent Partner, because out of the three of us here, you're the only Canadian.
Exactly.
And so, Silent Partner, directed by Daryl Duke and a little bit by Curtis Hanson. Tell us about that great movie.
Okay, so this is a film set and shot in mainland Canada, but specifically in Toronto. It stars Elliot Gould as a mild-mannered bank teller who is living a kind of just ordinary, not very exciting life, feels a bit disappointed and I guess feels ignored by his colleagues, including the wonderful John Candy, who appears in it, more Canadian pride. But what happens is he, in his job, in his day-to-day, he becomes aware that someone has been thinking or planning to rob the bank. He finds a note of someone saying, I have a gun in my pocket, give me all the money, which clearly they didn't use, and they sort of discarded. But he becomes aware, and then he eventually he recognizes the handwriting of the note with the Christmas signed by the kind of store mall Santa Claus who's collecting money played by the wonderful other Canadian pride and treasure, Christopher Plummer. So he becomes aware that this is someone who is thinking about robbing the bank, and he recognizes this. And rather than telling anyone, he sort of just keeps an eye on this. So when the Santa Claus turns up, he is now prepared. And what he's been doing is gradually sort of siphoning out some money, hiding it in a little lunchbox, and hiding it from his own till, so that when the actual robber turns up and gives him the note, another note saying, I have a gun, give me all the money, he does, sets off the alarm. Everyone chases the Santa Claus out of the mall and he gets away. And they now really think he's stolen a substantially larger portion of money, which now Elliot Gould walks away with this. So this is the setup of this. He has now made this kind of great, he has cheated the bank, he has cheated the robber, and he thinks he's gotten away with it until, of course, this is very quickly our thieving Santa realizes, because he keeps hearing news reports about the bank having lost substantially more money than he got. So then it begins this cat and mouse game between these two people, this mild-mannered bank teller who's now, I think, feeling pretty good about himself, and this really uncomfortable and quite nasty criminal who is now trying to not sort of blackmail, torment, terrorize him into giving him back the money. And he becomes the silent partner, say he is the silent partner. So then it's this cat and mouse game between these two men as they keep trying to one-up them to try to get what is, this money back. But also really it's beating the other one. It's trying to win out on the other one.
I'm gonna kill you, so help me. I'm gonna kill you.
Starring Elliot Gould, Christopher Plummer, and Susanna York.
One night, when you come home, you'll find me on the inside, and that'll be the night you'll wish you'd never been born.
It was the only way to make him the silent partner.
Because also it turns out that for Plummer he's a sadist. He's an extreme, borderline psychopathic, I think,
Yeah.
really. So he ends up doing some very terrible things to get his point across, to put pressure on Gould to say, give me my money.
Yeah.
Of course, you two saw none of this, because what happened with the link I sent you?
It was a cut print.
Yeah. Yeah, so we thought there were whole scenes that were really badly edited, but it just turned out there's a scene where Elliot Gould sleeps with someone, and we just went, well, it was really badly edited. What the hell was that? And obviously there was a whole sex scene that is just, it was cut by ITV in the early 80s. It's that sort of Valerie.
Yeah. But the gist was there. We know and you're right, Christopher Plummer's criminal is doing some pretty horrible things. And he begins by killing Gould's fish.
Yeah, I know, cruel, right?
Cruel. He has this, the marker, apologies to fish lovers around the world, but the marker of the fact that he is supposed to be the rather boring bank teller is that he takes pride and love of collecting tropical fish, to which then Christopher Rowan kills. And then it escalates until there's a really, even in the cut print, it is a brutal murder of the woman that Elliot Gould has become involved with. It's really it's a disturbing performance from Christopher Plummer. He's very good, and he is sort of nasty and sadistic. There is also a strange kind of queering of him. Like, I think he is presented as being, I think there's some queer coding which I think dates it a little bit.
Right.
Because, and then someone even said, oh, he's one of those weird ones. Like, and so I think there's a strange, and I think that is the one thing.
Oh, I thought it was more S&M. Ah, interesting.
To me, it came across, and I think it's one of those things that's difficult when you're looking at a film from the 70s.
Yeah.
Because I think it's a great performance by Christopher Plummer. I think he is really unsettling. I think you look at it now, and it does feel like they are queering him in a way that probably seemed quite progressive or interesting and in the 1970s. And now you go, this is a bit more problematic. So it's the one thing that I would recommend people see it, but it is the thing, and that becomes even more when he turns up in drag at the end.
Yes.
When he does, and he disguises, and it's a disguise. He's coming back into the bank.
Like
it's not
Santa.
Christmas. Yeah, it's no longer Christmas, so coming dressed as Santa won't work. and he dresses as a woman. And I think that's where, for me, I was a little uncomfortable with that, even though it's a really nice performance, but again, they tie into his difference in the fact that he plays it really in an interesting way, and like he's quite enjoying dressed in this drag outfit. And I think that dates it. But it's at the same time, it's a very powerful performance from Christopher Plummer, who's really frightening. But alongside this is Elliot Gould is even more disturbing, with which the lengths he will go to now just try to win this. Like how he will try to win the girl.
One of the interesting things about what you guys missed out on in the cuts to the film is that these are actually scenes that were done afterwards, and there were reshoots handled by Curtis Hanson, who wrote the screenplay, and it was actually the third version of an adaptation of this Danish novel that had already been done once in Denmark and once for television in Germany, in West Germany. Here he was asked to go back, and basically the producers, who in fact it was an early iteration of Korolko, Mario Casar, using the Canadian tax credit shelter system that became such a big thing at the time, and asked him to basically add some nudity, so you get the kind of love scene, and then you actually get this scene where the actress then wanders around the set nude for a few shots, and then this violent beheading, where you actually this incredibly gruesome shot involving the fish tank, because that's where the beheading takes place. And it's one of those things where it does feel a bit added, because it's unlike the rest of the film, which isn't quite so, shall we say, aggressive. I mean, I don't think Hansen was particularly happy about it, but, he went along, and it was probably his biggest production to date that he was involved with. But equally, the beheading, because you get the head inside the fridge shot, is one of the things that people remember from that top. So, it did add a certain kind of value to it in terms of exploitative material, to put it that way.
Just in terms of the cuts, because there's also an early scene where Christopher Plummer's character appears to beat up some woman, which was in the version we saw, was very odd. It's a very brief scene. There's a woman there, he walks in, then she's suddenly taken off, and then the next thing you know, she's in the hospital. And it's clearly some kind of violent scene.
There's more to it, but it's not particularly violent, as I recall.
Right. Yeah.
But you know what? I probably need to go and rewatch it a bit more carefully.
Yeah.
But it seems, my recollection is that obviously that's part of the plot, obviously. And so it's important because he ends up sort of in jail and then gets out again and all these sorts of things. So it's just part of, it adds sort of time passing to the narrative. And so it serves that purpose, because you guys clearly saw a kind of TV edit, I think, by the sounds of it. So sorry about that, because that was entirely my fault.
No, there's an interesting synergy, though, between the Christopher Plummer character and Gene Kelly's character, in the sense of, this guy goes to prison, then comes back, gets out, comes back for the denouement of the film. I don't know, Christmas and prison seems to go together in this.
Seems to go together a bit, yeah. So we're coming to the end of the podcast, and we have set ourselves up to try and make a noir case for probably everybody's favorite Christmas movie, and it is a wonderful film. But we are going to try and convince all our listeners that It's a Wonderful Life is also a sensational Christmas noir film. Yes. So I will quickly try and say why I think it is, and you guys tell me if you think this sounds about right. It seems to me that this is a film that starts with our protagonist who's getting ready to kill himself. We then get his story told in flashbacks, so we get his early life, which involves quite a lot of death and misery and sadness. So it's all quite downbeat, and he never gets to do anything he ever wanted to do. He never gets to travel, never gets to go anywhere. He always has to be the responsible one. And now things have gone seriously wrong with the company that he's had to take over, and he's thinking of killing himself. Through an intervention that turns out to be of heavenly origin, he ends up not dying as a suicide, but instead what happens is he gets the opportunity to see this wonderful life that the film alludes to Or rather, what would have happened if he had not been in it? And to me, this idea that you could present the specular version of the American dream of a life, where it becomes the stark, brutal reality of what happens with unfettered capitalism, where the housing is only given to people who can afford it, and there's no goodwill of any kind, and instead people are left to their most basic elements and their basest desires and drives. And the film piles it on and piles it on. The scene and when he goes to the cemetery is utterly appalling. And some of the shots, which are done with wide angle lenses, so that that camera go right into James Stewart's face. To me, this is the essence of film noir. So on the one side of the equation, you have everybody's favorite Christmas movie because it has got an angel in it, and it's got a funny voiceover, and it has charming moments about family life, and a famously redemptive ending. Although you can argue it's all about having to go to everybody for charity because you're broke. And thinking, okay, I'm not sure that's that positive, but okay. But it's telling you he's got lots of friends and he thought he didn't. And actually he has lots of friends who are willing to help in whatever way necessary when things go wrong. But the other side of that equation is, of course, what noir is all about, which is bringing, in a way, a more realistic view, a more psychoanalytical interpretation of the neuroses behind the problems that everyday life can create and what that does to people. And I think it handles both sides of it equally credibly. And in actual fact, if you're having to have an angel to tell you that everything is going to be all right, well, I find it way more plausible, in actual fact, to just get given the dark view of humanity. They're thinking, well, that doesn't require some form of supernatural force. This requires you to just think, oh, yeah, it's Wednesday. That's easier to relate to. So what do you guys think? Because I think it's a wonderful film, but I think it's a great film about film noir, as well as an example, in part, of film noir.
I agree, and if anyone's listening who hasn't seen It's a Wonderful Life, it's nowhere near as bleak and miserable and certainly it was made it out to be. There's a section of the film. I mean, what's interesting is that, the redemptive part of the film, the bit of the film that sends you out thinking this is the best Christmas movie ever, is really like the last sort of 15 minutes. And most of it is fairly grim. They do an episode of Friends where Phoebe turns it off and doesn't see the end and describes it as, the most
miserable
film she's ever seen. But the parallels, I mean, in the alternate He Doesn't Exist universe, where Bedford Falls has become Pottersville, and you've got the cigar club and the bamboo lounge, and Gloria Graham is basically the Deanna Durbin character from Christmas Holiday, who is selling something for money. There's big signs, there's dime a dance.
Yeah,
and some
being arrested and dragged into the police vehicle, screaming. Like it's not just that she is this fallen woman. No. Like this is a violent world. Like this is the image we see of her life. It's brutal.
And it also has parallels with Frankie Bono as well, because the essential part of the central message of It's a Wonderful Life is no man is a failure if he has friends. George Bailey is not alone. And the whole push-pull of Frankie Bono is, do I want to be alone? Do I not want to be alone? And George, despite the fact he's surrounded by all these people who care about him, thinks that they don't, so he feels like he's alone, even though he's surrounded. So I think there are very clear parallels. And the other thing I personally would throw into the mix with this is, of course, lurking under the shadows of It's a Wonderful Life is A Christmas Carol, which is the ultimate kind of gothic Christmas story. And the gothic and noir, if they're not bedfellows, then they're certainly friends with benefits, put it that way. So there are clear parallels between those things. So I think there's a line. I mean, if you look at, say, for example, the recent TV version of A Christmas Carol with Guy Pearce, which is this incredibly dark, brilliantly gothic Victorian noir
Yeah.
retelling of the tale.
Yeah.
I mean, I could be wrong. It's been a while since I've seen it, but I think there are parallels between some of the imagery in that and some of the imagery in It's a Wonderful Life. So my feeling is that even though as a entire package, the film is very uplifting, there are strands of noir kind of thread all of the way through it.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, and again, I'm going to echo what Simon said at the beginning. There's a lot of pleasure and happiness and joy in this film. But what it's doing is it's saying, here we do see this beautiful town with lots of good people. You have Bert the cop and Ernie the taxi driver.
I think that's
I
right.
think that's the right order. And they're all characters and they're beautifully played by great classic actors working in Hollywood. You know, you have Gloria Graham. You've got lots of personality to this town. And it is a kind of very joyful place, but it's small town life. And what you have at the center is someone who aspires to something else. He wants to escape. He wants to go, not because he hates it, because he's got big ideas. He wants to see the world. He wants to do things. He keeps saying, I want to build things. I want to escape. I want to get out of here. And he can't. And the responsibilities of life keep stopping him because in one part of him, he's a good person. He doesn't want Mr. Potter to take over the building and loan and that because he sees as the one thing that gives people a chance, that opposes the monstrously Scrooge-like capitalist Mr. Potter. But at the same time, and the only way he could do that is by giving up his dreams. Like he has to give up his dreams to be. So he's torn between what he wants to do for himself and what he wants to do for his family, his community. He's torn between the love of his life and in a scene that I think is both beautiful and horrifically dark is the scene where he and Donna Reed, I've forgotten that. Mary, thank you, Mary. Mary finally kind of admit they love each other, but she is kind of excited to see him. They've had sort of a brief encounter earlier on, and then she come back from college and they reunite, and she is excited to see him, and he sees her as a trap. He's in love with her. He clearly is in love with her, but he also sees her as a trap. He's recognizing that if he gives into this, he's yet again giving in and gonna have it. And I think that is a really powerful scene of darkness alongside happiness. And when they finally embrace, it's a violent embrace. Like there's something quite dark about that. And so I think there's something really interesting about the ways in which he is struggling to do all of this, which is why the alternate universe is so powerful, because what you're really seeing is in a way that all of that darkness unleashed. It's like all the goodness, the good possibilities of his life have been stripped away. And all he's saying is this brutal life.
There's that great moment where Potter, brilliantly played by Lionel Barrymore, he's so mean. He says, "You once called me a warped, frustrated old man. What are you except a warped, frustrated young man?"
Yeah.
And in a sense, that alternate world is kind of like it's like the manifestation of how George feels.
Yes, exactly.
Being trapped in this lovely, fantastic, but cloying kind of small town. It's almost as if, I want to go out and I want to build modern cities. That dream becomes the Bamboo Lounge and the Cigar Club and all that sort of nastiness. And then that's the noir depiction of the city.
Yeah.
Right? So he wants to go out and build cities, even though Pottersville is a small town.
It's very urban.
It's very urban in that moment. And so his vision of his version of the cities that he's building are going to end up being noir depictions of cities.
Yeah.
Not necessarily that he's responsible for all this, but of course he is, his absence is responsible for everything that happens. So,
well, in a way, it's this idea that his presence is emblematic, but also symptomatic of his not being there means there's no room for someone that has his sense of civic duty, responsibility,
Exactly.
and to a certain extent, of course, world-building positivity.
Yeah.
So that although you get sort of funny scenes when he and Mary and George Bailey and Mary go home, and there's that bits of the house that are falling apart, and they've just helped somebody else get their dream home.
Yeah.
But at the same time, they're not living large. They have a very modest house of their own, and they've got kids, and they've got the same problems everybody else has. That dichotomy is a part of the everyday experience, is that you do things because you have that sense of, you can turn it into an obligation and start feeling resentful, but you can also feel that you'll have the strength, the will, the talent to be able to actually support and help other people. But if that isn't present in your world, if there isn't room for that, if there isn't a nurturing environment, then everybody will in fact revert to a form of atavistic behavior that is fundamentally destructive. It's like talking about the basics of biology. In the end, cells want to fall apart. At basic level, they want to pull away. They don't want to join up. They want to go back and be their own thing. And the society is in the same thing. It's a contract. It's a compact. You have to agree to be civilized, because if you don't, then it will never work. Fundamentally, and you therefore have to prove it over and over again. And so I agree with you. It's at its most basic terms, of course, it's simply the difference between saying something's a dream and it's noble and it's positive. And I think it's when we were watching Megalopolis, you and I, it was one of those things where, for all the kind of failings of ambition of that film, you end up feeling more positive towards that film, because you know that the ambitious beliefs that it has for itself are fundamentally positive, and then they're about the value of art, and they're about saying these things matter. And it's about saying, don't be pulled away from that. Don't be distracted. Don't let other things win out when all they care about is money and power. When actually the difference here is about saying, well, you can have money and power, but it's what you do with it that matters. For its own sake, it has no value. That's what's interesting to me about It's a Wonderful Life, is that it allows you to explore those two aspects of it. This idea that you have someone with tremendous ideals and all those great things about youth. And then you get older and things become more difficult and take longer, and your own abilities aren't quite the same. And you sort of say, can I still have that optimism? Can I still have that root positivity that allows me to think, despite all the setbacks, that you actually still want to see the good people and the best in people, and you want to be glad to be able to contribute in some positive way. And I think, well, I know which one of those two I respect the more. I also know which is the two that in cinema is more dynamically shown, because if you use expressionistic lighting and dramatic moods and in the fabulous music and actors who are able to show that neurosis that come through, you're thinking, well, it's there even in the best of us, and you have to keep it at bay.
I mean, that's why I say I think it's one of the great Jimmy Stewart performances. And people often, it's very easy to look at his career in kind of his early Capra-esque periods. And it's very easy to see that as these very all-American, inspiring, these kind of rather innocent characters. And then you see him in his later, his kind of his man Western period, and we have his Hitchcock period. But I think here we see all of that because he plays a character who is so torn between lots of desires, that we do see a kind of complexity in his performance, that he is comical and sweet and a loving husband and father and friend and someone who really believes in his community and wants to help. But you just see so much pain in him too. And I think that shot you mentioned earlier, but it moves into this close-up, extreme close-up of his face as he's realized that he's in this nightmare world and everything is gone. You see the Hitchcock Stewart that will come. It really feels like this is a Vertigo moment. Because you just see so much pain and suffering and borderline at that moment, borderline psychosis, in the sense, he has really lost everything. As far as he's because you have to stop and just go, yes, we watch it, angels, it's fun and all this. But from his perspective, he is walking around his town and he doesn't believe this guy's an angel and is now everything he believes in has been pulled away from him in terms of not just angels do really exist, but His mother doesn't recognize him. His brother died as a child. The woman he loves screams when she sees him because, he keeps saying that you're my wife.
He's become a librarian.
No.
Oh my God.
I know, exactly. I do think it's a really beautiful performance from him of complexity, and it's in the complexity of that shot, of that darkness and that pain, that is the reason why the ending is so moving. To see the joy coming out of him of now finally, like you could look at this and say, It's a Wonderful Life, it's sort of sentimental, it's, oh yes, angels, yes, and the line, you're richer because you have friends. But there is that sense of saying, finding the value in the things that count. So yes, people will give you money and help you out when you need it, but also just saying, actually, you are surrounded by people who love you. And you have built something. You wanted to build things, you have built something.
And that was what makes him the richest man in town.
Exactly. And so it really works. And I think his performance of the joy, the Zuzu's pedals, he pulls out the pedals from his pocket. There's so much joy that I think that payoff is because he plays the darkness so well. That you really believe that there's an edge to him. So that transformation, and that's what goes back to the Christmas Carol. And I think it is, in some respects, we've always said that this is like the best, this is such a great version of A Christmas Carol because he has this intervention that teaches him not to be a better person. I mean, Scrooge needed to learn to be a better person.
Scrooge Bailey's had a tough time already.
Bailey's a good person is about recognizing the value of who you are, rather than having to recognize the value in people around you, which is what Scrooge does.
But it's also anti-aspirational in the sense it's about, being thankful for what you have and not always thinking about what you need next.
Exactly.
Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas.
I was say, so thank you both for coming onto the podcast to discuss these desperately depressing Christmas movies.
Except for It's a Wonderful Life.
Well, I was going to say, John. So you two come Christmas Day, what will you be watching?
If we're not watching It's a Wonderful Life, and let's drop this in because we can, the Shop Around the Corner. And Christmas Day Pleasures.
Does star Jimmy Stewart.
And Frank Morgan, who's the wizard in The Wizard of Oz. And if you've never seen A Shop Around the Corner, watch it.
It is delightful.
It's great.
It is a lovely film.
And there's, at no point in it does it enter a kind of dark
noir
hell dimension.
No.
So, yeah.
No. But It's a Wonderful Life will undoubtedly play a role at some point.
On which note, thanks very much, guys. And, see you in 2025.
Yeah. Merry Christmas, Trey Jones.
Merry Christmas.
I think it's time for you to feed Lily.
I will feed Lily.
You have been listening to Tipping My Fedora, the show about all things noir. It is produced for Castiglione Publishing by me, Sergio Angelini, and our theme tune is by Petar Milinkovic, whose work is available through Tailkeeper Music. All audio clips are the copyright of their respective owners, and used under fair dealing and fair use exceptions solely for the purposes of criticism and review. Please subscribe to Tipping My Fedora wherever you get your podcast fix, and it would be great if you could leave ratings and reviews about the show at Apple Podcasts. Be seeing you.